Sometimes the kindest gesture in our darkest hour stays with us forever. In 1882, a mountain man named Caleb Stone rode into Timber Creek, Wyoming, after 15 years alone in the wilderness. The townspeople had lined up 10 young brides for him to choose from. Everyone expected him to pick the youngest and prettiest. Instead, Caleb walked past all of them and stopped in front of Margaret Hayes, a 48-year-old widow with grey hair and work-worn hands. "I'll take the oldest one," he said. The crowd stared in disbelief. But Caleb never forgot what Margaret had done for him years ago. A simple act of kindness when he had nothing and no one cared. What did she do that made him remember her after all this time? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The Wyoming Territory stretched out vast and unforgiving in the summer of 1882, a land where survival demanded more than hope. It required grit, determination, and a willingness to endure what softer souls could not. Timber Creek sat nestled in a valley between rolling hills and distant mountain peaks, a town that had grown from a trading post into a modest settlement of about 200 souls. Wooden buildings lined the main street, their facades weathered by wind and sun, testament to the harsh winters and scorching summers that defined life on the frontier. The town square stood at the heart of everything, a patch of trampled earth where wagons gathered on market days and children played when chores were finished. A general store anchored one corner, run by Mrs. Chen, a Chinese immigrant who'd come west with her late husband during the railroad boom. Her store sold everything from flour and coffee to fabrics and tools, and she possessed a sharp mind for business that earned respect even from those who might otherwise have shown her none. Across the square stood the sheriff's office, a sturdy building with iron bars on the windows and a small jail in back. Sheriff Tom Brennan had held his position for 7 years, a fair man with grey threading through his brown beard and eyes that missed little. He'd been a cavalry officer once, before a leg wound at Little Bighorn sent him looking for quieter work. He found that Timber Creek offered its own challenges, just of a different nature. The white church, with its modest steeple, served as the town's spiritual center, presided over by Pastor Williams, a widower himself who'd come west after losing his wife to consumption back in Philadelphia. He was a thoughtful man, given to long sermons that sometimes tested his congregation's patience, but his genuine compassion for his flock made up for his tendency toward wordiness. Margaret Hayes lived in a 2-story boarding house on the edge of the main street, a building she'd managed to hold on to through 5 years of widowhood by sheer determination and careful economy. The house had seen better days, the paint peeling in places, the porch steps worn smooth by countless footfalls, but Margaret kept it clean and respectable. She rented rooms to travelers passing through and to a few permanent boarders. Old Mr. Patterson, who'd worked the silver mines until his lungs gave out, and 2 railroad clerks who'd been transferred to the regional office. Margaret herself was a woman who carried her years with dignity. At 48, she had silver streaking through hair that had once been dark brown, pulled back in a practical bun that showed the strong lines of her face. Her hands were work-worn, roughened by years of washing, cooking, and maintaining her property without help. She'd come west 20 years ago as a young bride, full of romantic notions about frontier life that reality had tempered into something harder and more enduring. Her late husband, Thomas Hayes, had been a dreamer, a kind man with a gentle soul who'd believed every mining claim and business venture would finally be the one to make their fortune. He'd died 5 years ago in a cave-in at the Silver Bell mine, leaving Margaret with debts, a boarding house, and memories of a love that had been genuine even if it hadn't been practical. She'd paid off those debts through careful management and endless work, and she'd sworn to herself that she'd never again depend solely on another person for her survival. The idea of the bride selection hadn't been Margaret's. It came from the town council, a group of businessmen and property owners who met monthly to discuss Timber Creek's affairs. They'd noticed the shortage of women in the territory, the way young men drifted through without putting down roots, the way the town's growth had stalled. Someone, probably Donald Pierce, who owned the largest ranch in the valley, suggested advertising back east for women willing to come west as brides. The response surprised everyone. Letters arrived from Boston, Philadelphia, New York, and even from as far as Charleston. Young women seeking adventure, escaping poverty, fleeing bad situations, or simply wanting a fresh start. The council selected 10, paid their train fare, and arranged for them to arrive in early June. The young women ranged in age from 18 to 26. There was sweet-faced Emma from Boston, who'd worked in a textile mill and dreamed of clean air. Dark-haired Catherine from New York, a seamstress with clever hands and ambitious eyes. Blonde Mary from Philadelphia, quiet and nervous but determined. The others each had their own stories, their own reasons for taking such a dramatic leap into the unknown. The plan was simple. Introduce the young women to eligible bachelors in town and the surrounding ranches. Let courtships develop naturally. But then word came down from the high country that Caleb Stone was coming to town, and the council saw an opportunity. Caleb Stone had become something of a legend in the 15 years he'd lived in the mountains. Trappers and traders who encountered him told stories of a man who lived alone in a cabin somewhere in the high passes, who could track anything, who survived winters that would kill most men. He came down twice a year to trade furs and hides, always alone, always quiet, never staying more than a day or two before disappearing back into the wilderness. No one knew much about his past. He'd arrived in the territory years ago with nothing, passed through Timber Creek like a ghost, and vanished into the mountains. The few who'd dealt with him reported that he was honest in his trades, kept his word, and asked nothing of anyone. Some said he'd been running from something. Others said he simply preferred solitude to the complications of civilization. When word reached town that Caleb was coming down to trade and had just mentioned, that he might consider settling down if the right situation presented itself, the council pounced on the idea. Here was a man of property, a man with valuable skills, a man who could contribute to the community. They sent a message back with the trader. Come to town, meet some fine young women who'd traveled far for a new life. Margaret heard about all this through her friend Sarah Mitchell, another widow who ran the town's small cafe. Sarah had been Margaret's closest confidant since Thomas died, a practical woman with a good heart who'd lost her own husband to pneumonia 3 winters back. They're calling it a bride selection, Sarah said, shaking her head as she sat in Margaret's kitchen drinking coffee. Like the man's picking out a horse, it seems undignified. Margaret had agreed, but she understood the reality. Marriage on the frontier was often practical first, romantic second. Women needed security. Men needed partners who could work beside them, bear children, help build a life in harsh country. Love, when it came, was a blessing, but survival was the necessity. She hadn't expected to be included in the arrangement. She was nearly 50, a widow, set in her ways. But Pastor Williams had approached her gently, suggesting that her presence might comfort the younger women, that her experience could help guide them. And truthfully, some of the council members thought it might be good to have a more mature woman available, should one of the older bachelors prefer someone closer to his own age. Margaret had resisted at first, but the boarding house repairs were piling up, winter would come again, and she was tired, bone tired, of struggling alone. She agreed to stand with the others, though she assumed no one would give her a second glance. The day of Caleb Stone's arrival had drawn the entire town to the square. Word had spread, and curiosity ran high. What kind of man lived alone in the mountains for 15 years? What would he look like? Would he actually choose one of these women, or would he take one look and ride back to his isolation? Margaret stood at the end of the line of women, wearing her best dress, a simple grey cotton that she'd made herself 3 years ago. She felt out of place next to the younger women in their carefully chosen travelling clothes, their nervous excitement palpable in the warm afternoon air. She remembered watching the road, seeing the dust rise as a lone rider approached. The town fell quiet as Caleb Stone rode into Timber Creek, and Margaret got her first real look at the man who would change everything. Caleb Stone rode a large roan horse that looked as weathered and capable as its rider. He sat straight in the saddle, moving with the easy grace of a man completely comfortable in his own skin. As he drew closer, Margaret could make out more details. He was tall, she'd guess over 6 feet, with broad shoulders and the lean build of someone who worked hard every day of his life. His face was deeply tanned and lined by sun and wind, with a thick beard that was more grey than brown. She guessed he was somewhere in his mid-40s, though the mountains had a way of aging a man beyond his years. He wore buckskin pants and a simple cotton shirt, with a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his eyes. A rifle rested in a scabbard on his saddle, and he carried himself with the quiet alertness of someone accustomed to watching for danger. But what struck Margaret most was his expression, not hostile or cold, but deeply uncomfortable, like a wild animal that had wandered too close to a settlement and now regretted it. Sheriff Brennan stepped forward to greet him as he dismounted. "Mr. Stone, welcome back to Timber Creek." Caleb nodded, his voice low and rough from disuse. "Sheriff? Appreciate you coming down. We've got some fine young ladies here who've traveled a long way. Council thought you might like to meet them, see if any might suit for a wife." Margaret watched Caleb's jaw tighten slightly. He looked past the sheriff at the line of women, his eyes moving slowly across their faces. She saw something flash in his expression. Was it pain? Discomfort? She couldn't quite name it, but she recognized it. It was the look of a man being put on display, expected to perform, and finding the whole situation deeply distasteful. Pastor Williams stepped up, trying to ease the tension with his gentle manner. "There's no pressure here, Mr. Stone. We're just providing an opportunity for introductions. These ladies have come west, seeking honest men and new lives. We thought you might appreciate meeting them in a respectful setting." Caleb removed his hat, running a hand through his grey-streaked hair. Didn't realize it would be quite so formal. "We can do this however you're comfortable," the sheriff said. "Just thought it'd be proper to let you meet everyone at once." The young women stood nervously, some with hopeful smiles, others looking down at their hands. Margaret felt a surge of sympathy for them. This was awkward for everyone involved. These young women being inspected like goods at market, this mountain man being pushed into civilization's rituals when he clearly preferred solitude. The town council had organized it all with business-like efficiency. Each young woman would step forward, give her name and where she was from, say a bit about herself. Then Caleb could ask questions if he wished, or simply nod and move on. At the end, if he was interested in anyone, he could say so. If not, well, there were other men in town and on the ranches who were eager to meet them. Donald Pierce stood near the front of the crowd, arms crossed over his substantial chest. He owned the largest ranch in the valley and carried himself with the confidence of a man used to getting what he wanted. He'd already made it clear he had his eye on young Catherine, the seamstress from New York. The introductions began. Emma from Boston stepped forward first, her voice soft but steady. She was pretty, with auburn hair and green eyes, and she spoke about her experience working in the mills, her love of reading, her hope to find a clean, honest life in the West. Caleb listened politely, his face unreadable. "Thank you, miss," was all he said. One by one, the young women came forward. Mary from Philadelphia, who'd helped her mother run a boarding house and knew how to manage a household. Catherine from New York, with her clever hands and quick smile. Rachel from Virginia, who'd grown up on a farm and wasn't afraid of hard work. Each had their story, their hopes, their courage in coming so far from everything familiar. Caleb remained courteous but distant. He nodded to each, thanked them for their words, but Margaret could see he was growing more uncomfortable with each introduction. This wasn't how a man like him would choose a partner. Not in front of a crowd, not with this artificial formality, not with everyone watching and judging. When the last of the younger women had finished, Pastor Williams gestured toward Margaret. "And this is Mrs. Margaret Hayes. She runs the boarding house and has been kind enough to stand with our visiting ladies." Margaret felt every eye turn to her. She hadn't prepared any speech, hadn't thought anyone would care what she said. She stepped forward slightly, feeling foolish. "I'm Margaret Hayes," she said simply. "I've lived in Timber Creek for 20 years. I'm a widow." She didn't know what else to say that wouldn't sound like she was advertising herself, which she certainly wasn't. "I hope these young ladies find good matches here." She started to step back, but something made her glance at Caleb Stone. He was staring at her, his eyes suddenly intense, focused. She saw recognition flash across his face, followed by something that looked almost like wonder. The moment stretched out. The crowd began to murmur, confused by the mountain man's fixed attention on the oldest woman present. Then Caleb Stone did something no one expected. He walked forward, past all the young women, and stopped, directly in front of Margaret. Up close, she could see his eyes were blue-gray, like a winter sky, and they were looking at her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "I'll take the oldest one," he said quietly, but clearly enough that everyone heard. The town square erupted, gasps, exclamations, confused voices overlapping. Margaret stood frozen, unable to process what she'd just heard. "Now wait just a minute," Donald Pierce called out. "These young ladies came all this way. Surely you want to consider—" "I've made my choice," Caleb said, his voice still quiet, but with an edge of finality that cut through the noise. Sheriff Brennan stepped forward, clearly trying to manage the situation. "Mr. Stone, perhaps you'd like some time to think this over. Mrs. Hayes is a fine woman, but she's not. That is, she wasn't really part of the arrangement." "She's the one I want," Caleb said. Margaret found her voice, though it came out shakier than she'd have liked. "I don't understand. You don't even know me." Caleb turned those intense eyes back to her. "Don't I?" Something in his tone sent a chill through her. Did she know him? She searched his weathered face, tried to see past the beard and the lines and the years. There was something familiar, perhaps, but she couldn't place it. "I knew you once," Caleb said. "A long time ago. You probably don't remember." The crowd pressed closer, everyone straining to hear. Margaret felt lightheaded. "When?" 15 years ago. I came through town, broke and desperate. Everyone else turned me away. You gave me water and food. You spoke to me like I was a human being, not garbage to be swept aside." Margaret's mind raced backward through the years. 15 years ago. She'd been newly married then, still learning the rhythms of frontier life. How many people had passed through town in those years? How many faces had she seen and forgotten? I'm sorry, I don't remember, she admitted. You wouldn't, Caleb said. It was nothing to you, a small kindness, but it was everything to me. It kept me from giving up, from becoming someone bitter and hard. I went into those mountains, and every day for 15 years, I remembered that someone had been kind when they didn't have to be. Pastor Williams cleared his throat. That's a beautiful sentiment, Mr. Stone, but surely you understand that Mrs. Hayes might need time to consider such a proposal. Caleb nodded, taking a step back, as if suddenly aware of how close he'd come, how intense his focus had been. Of course. I don't mean to pressure anyone. I just wanted to be clear about my choice, if a choice was being asked for. Margaret's heart pounded. The younger women looked relieved, confused, some perhaps a bit offended. The townspeople buzzed with gossip and speculation. Donald Pierce looked furious, though Margaret couldn't imagine why he'd care. I need to speak with you, Margaret said to Caleb, finding some steadiness in her voice. Privately, before any decisions are made. I'll be at the hotel, Caleb said, whenever you're ready. He nodded to the sheriff, to the pastor, and to the assembled crowd. Then he took his horse's reins and walked toward the small hotel at the end of the street, leaving chaos in his wake. Margaret stood in the town square, feeling the weight of dozens of eyes on her, hearing the whispers starting up around her. Sarah pushed through the crowd and took her arm. Well, Sarah said quietly. That was unexpected. Margaret let out a breath she didn't know she'd been holding. I don't even remember him. Apparently he remembers you, Sarah said. The question is, what are you going to do about it? Margaret looked toward the hotel, where Caleb Stone had disappeared from view. A mountain man who'd remembered one small act of kindness for 15 years, who'd come down from his isolation and chosen her, not the pretty young women with their whole lives ahead of them. It was the most ridiculous, impractical, impossible thing she'd ever heard. And yet, standing there in the warm afternoon sun with the whole town watching, Margaret felt something she hadn't experienced in the 5 years since Thomas died. She felt seen. Courtship in Timber Creek was a public affair. There were no private moments, no secrets. Every walk Margaret and Caleb took through town was observed, commented upon, and analyzed by the entire community. Some watched with approval, others with skepticism, but everyone watched. Caleb proved to be a patient suitor. He came to call 3 times a week, always at the times they'd agreed upon, always respectful. He helped Margaret with tasks around the boarding house without being asked, fixed a broken shutter, replaced worn steps, mended the fence. He did these things quietly, competently, and when she thanked him, he'd just nod and say it needed doing. They took walks in the evening, when the summer heat had faded to something bearable. Caleb told her about his life before the mountains, growing up on a Missouri farm, learning to work the land from his father, the slow heartbreak of watching that farm fail despite all their efforts. My father never stopped believing he could make it work, Caleb said one evening as they walked along the creek that gave the town its name. Every bad season, every setback, he'd say next year would be better. He worked himself into an early grave believing that. You learned something from that, Margaret observed. I learned that belief isn't enough. You need more than hope to survive. You need skill and luck and the sense to know when to walk away. Margaret thought about Thomas and his endless schemes. My husband was like your father, always believing the next opportunity would be the one. I loved him for his optimism, but it was hard sometimes, being the practical one. You don't strike me as someone who resents being practical. I don't. But sometimes I wonder what it would be like to be the one who dreams instead of the one who worries. Caleb smiled, a rare expression that softened his weathered face. Maybe you can be both. Maybe that's what makes a good partnership. One person dreams and the other keeps them grounded, and sometimes they switch roles. They talked about books. Margaret was surprised to learn Caleb read voraciously, borrowed books from traders and read them by lamplight through the long mountain winters. They discovered a shared love of poetry, though Caleb was embarrassed to admit it. Not very manly, I suppose, he said. Nonsense, Margaret replied. Anyone who thinks poetry isn't manly hasn't read the right poems. There's plenty of strength in good verse. She began lending him books from her small collection, and they'd discuss them on their walks. Caleb had opinions, thoughtful observations that showed he'd spent a lot of time thinking deeply about what he read. Mrs. Chen became an unexpected ally. She'd stop Margaret at the store to ask about Caleb, and she'd always have some small item she thought Margaret might want to buy. A new ribbon, a nice soap, little luxuries Margaret rarely allowed herself. A woman should feel pretty when she's being courted, Mrs. Chen said firmly. No arguments. Special price for you. Even the young brides, now settling into their own courtships and marriages, warmed to the romance of it. Emma, the girl from Boston, approached Margaret at church one Sunday. Mrs. Hayes, I wanted to tell you, I think what Mr. Stone did was the most romantic thing I've ever heard. At first I thought it was strange, but now I see it. He saw past surfaces to what really matters. Margaret was touched. Thank you, Emma. I hope your own courtship is going well. It is, Emma said, blushing. James is a good man. Not romantic like your mountain man, but steady and kind. Not everyone was so accepting. The resistance came from an unexpected quarter, Donald Pierce, the wealthy rancher. Margaret had never had much interaction with Pierce. He was prominent in town, sat on the council, and generally considered himself above the concerns of people like her. But lately, he'd been making his presence felt. It started with a visit to her boarding house. Pierce arrived in his fine buggy, dressed in an expensive suit, and asked to speak with her about a business matter. Mrs. Hayes, I'll be direct, he said, sitting in her parlor with the confidence of a man used to getting his way. Your property here is valuable. Prime location, good bones on the building. I'm prepared to make you a generous offer. More than generous. Margaret felt her spine stiffen. My boarding house isn't for sale, Mr. Pierce. Every property is for sale at the right price. I'm offering you more than you'd make in 5 years of renting rooms. You could retire comfortably, perhaps move to a bigger town, have an easier life. I like my life here, Margaret said firmly. Pierce's smile didn't reach his eyes. With all due respect, you're getting older, and running a boarding house is hard work, especially for a woman alone. Of course, I heard you might not be alone much longer, this business with the mountain man. He said it dismissively, as if Caleb were something slightly distasteful. My personal life is my own concern, Mr. Pierce. Of course. I'm just saying, a woman in your position should think carefully about her future. Stone is a wild man, barely civilized. Who knows if he'll stick around once he realizes what town life really demands. Better to have your own security, your own resources. Margaret stood, making it clear the conversation was over. I appreciate your offer, Mr. Pierce, but my answer is no. My boarding house is my independence, and I'm not selling it. Pierce stood as well, his expression hardening slightly. "Think about it, Mrs. Hayes. My offer won't stand forever." After he left, Margaret felt unsettled. There was something in Pierce's manner that felt like a threat, though he'd said nothing overtly threatening. She mentioned it to Caleb on their next walk. "He's been trying to buy up property all over town," Caleb said, his jaw tight. Sheriff mentioned it. "Pierce wants to control more of Timber Creek, maybe push it to become a county seat. More power, more influence. But why would he pressure me specifically?" Caleb was quiet for a moment. "Your property sits at a good crossroads, and maybe he doesn't like that you're choosing your own path instead of accepting his idea of what's best for you." "What should I do?" "What you've already done," Caleb said firmly. "Stand your ground. You've got more steel in your spine than Pierce has in his whole body." But the pressure didn't stop there. Over the next week, subtle comments began circulating through town. Someone suggested that Margaret's boarding house wasn't being properly maintained, that perhaps it wasn't safe for lodgers. Someone else questioned whether a woman of her age should be running a business at all, especially if she was considering a marriage. Margaret recognized Pierce's hand in these whispers, though she couldn't prove it. He was trying to undermine her position, to make her feel vulnerable, so she'd accept his offer. One evening, as Margaret was closing up for the night, she found a note slipped under her door. It was written in an elegant hand. "A respectable widow should know her place. Consorting with mountain savages reflects poorly on this community." Margaret crumpled the note, fury rising in her chest. The next morning, she dressed in her best dress, pinned her hair with Caleb's carved comb, and walked to the town square. Donald Pierce was there, speaking with members of the town council. Margaret walked straight up to him, her voice clear and carrying in the morning air. "Mr. Pierce, I want to be very clear. My boarding house is not for sale. Not now. Not ever. My choice of companions is my own business. And if you have concerns about my conduct or my property, you can address them to my face instead of through whispers and anonymous notes." The square fell silent. Pierce's face reddened. "I'm sure I don't know what you're talking about, Mrs. Hayes." "I'm sure you do," Margaret said calmly. "And I'm sure everyone here knows it too. I've lived in this town for 20 years. I've earned my place here through hard work and honest dealing. I won't be intimidated or pushed aside." She turned and walked away, head high, feeling the eyes of the town on her back. Her hands were shaking, but she kept her stride steady until she reached her boarding house. Caleb was waiting on her porch. He'd witnessed the confrontation from across the square. "That was the bravest thing I've ever seen," he said quietly. Margaret's composure finally cracked, and she sank onto the porch steps. "I was terrified." "Couldn't tell." Caleb sat beside her. "You faced him down like a warrior." "I'm tired of being pushed around," Margaret said. "I'm tired of people thinking they can decide what's best for me." Caleb didn't touch her. They hadn't reached that level of familiarity yet. But his presence beside her was solid and reassuring. "You know what I admired most about you giving me that water 15 years ago?" he said. "It wasn't just the kindness. It was that you did it even when your husband disapproved, even when it went against what was expected. You've always had that strength, Margaret. You've just forgotten it sometimes." Margaret looked at him. This mountain man who'd remembered her through 15 years of solitude, and felt something shift in her chest. Not just gratitude or companionship, but something deeper. "Would you like to come inside for coffee?" she asked. Caleb smiled. "I'd like that very much." The courtship deepened through the warm days of late summer. Margaret found herself looking forward to Caleb's visits with an anticipation she hadn't felt in years. He was unlike any man she'd known, quiet where Thomas had been talkative, steady where Thomas had been impulsive. But both men shared a fundamental decency that Margaret had come to value above all else. One evening, as they sat on her porch watching fireflies dance over the prairie grass, Margaret showed Caleb the silver locket she wore. "This was Thomas's first anniversary gift to me," she said, opening it to reveal the photograph and the wedding ring nestled beside it. "I wore the ring for 20 years, 5 of them after he died." Caleb studied the photograph, a young man with kind eyes and an optimistic smile. "He looks like he was a good man." He was. Not perfect, but good. He loved me the best way he knew how. "Do you feel guilty?" Caleb asked gently. "About moving forward?" Margaret considered the question carefully. "I did at first. It felt like a betrayal. But I went to his grave and talked to him about you, and I realized something. Thomas would want me to be happy. He'd probably like you, actually. You're both dreamers in your own ways." "I'm a dreamer?" "You live alone in the mountains by choice. You kept a tin cup for 15 years because it meant something to you. That's not practical, that's poetry." Caleb laughed, a sound that was becoming more frequent. "Never thought of it that way. Thomas was always chasing the next big opportunity. You chose solitude and peace, different dreams, but both of you followed your hearts instead of taking the safe path." Caleb reached out, hesitated, then gently took her hand. It was the first time they'd touched beyond formal handshakes, and Margaret felt the calluses on his palm, the warmth of his skin. "I'm glad you kept your ring," he said. "And I'm glad you moved it to the locket. That feels right. Keeping him close, but leaving room for something new." Margaret turned his hand over, looking at the lines of work etched into his skin. "Tell me about your life up there. The real life, not just the beautiful parts." So Caleb told her about the hard winters when snow blocked his cabin door for days at a time, when he had to dig his way out to feed his animals, about the spring when a bear destroyed half his supplies and he had to survive on very little until he could trap enough to trade, about the loneliness that sometimes felt like a physical weight, especially on holidays when he'd imagine what families in town were doing. "Why did you stay?" Margaret asked. "If it was that hard." "Because it was honest," Caleb said. "No pretending, no politics, no having to be someone I wasn't. Just me and the mountain and the work of surviving. There's a purity to that." "But you're willing to give it up?" "I'm willing to try something different," he corrected. "I'm thinking maybe I could split my time, spend summers in the mountains, winters in town, or find some balance. I'm not ready to give up the mountains entirely, but I'm also not ready to give up." He paused, meeting her eyes. "Give up the possibility of having someone to share life with." Margaret felt her heart flutter like a girl's. "I'd like that. I've always wanted to see the mountains up close, and I won't ask you to give up what makes you who you are." They talked about practical things then, how such an arrangement might work, what it would mean for the boarding house, whether Margaret could manage both lives. She told him about her fear of depending on someone else, of losing the independence she'd fought so hard to maintain. "I don't want to take your independence," Caleb said. "I've lived alone too long to want to control anyone. What I want is partnership. 2 people choosing to walk the same path because they want to, not because they have to." It was exactly what Margaret needed to hear. As summer turned toward autumn, they began making plans. They decided to marry in October, after the harvest festival, when the aspens in the mountains would be turning gold. It would be a simple ceremony with just the town and a few friends. Then they'd spend the winter in town, and in spring, Caleb would take Margaret up to see his cabin in the mountains. But one issue remained unresolved: Donald Pierce's continued pressure. The attempts to buy her property had stopped after her public confrontation, but Pierce had shifted tactics. He began spreading subtle rumors about Caleb, suggesting the mountain man was unstable, unreliable, possibly dangerous. Sheriff Brennan warned Margaret about the talk. Pierce is telling anyone who'll listen that Stone might have a dark past. Says no man lives alone in the mountains for 15 years unless he's running from something. "And what do you think?" Margaret asked. Brennan shrugged. "I think a man's entitled to his privacy. Stone's been nothing but respectful since he came to town. Pays his debts, causes no trouble. If he's running from something, it's his own business unless it becomes a legal matter." Margaret appreciated the sheriff's fairness, but she knew she needed to address this directly with Caleb. That evening, she asked him plainly, "Are you running from something? Pierce is suggesting you have secrets, and I need to know if there's truth to it." Caleb's face went still, and Margaret saw something flash in his eyes. Pain, perhaps, or old fear. "Everyone has a past, Margaret. Mine's no darker than most, but it's not entirely clean either. Tell me." Caleb took a deep breath. "When I left Missouri, I was running, but not from what Pierce probably thinks. I'll tell you the whole story, but I need you to understand something first. What I did or didn't do, the choices I made, they've haunted me for 15 years. Part of why I stayed in the mountains was because I didn't feel I deserved anything better." Margaret felt a chill run through her. "What happened?" "Not here," Caleb said, looking around at the town where ears were always listening. "Tomorrow. Let me take you up into the foothills, away from everyone. I'll tell you everything, and then you can decide if you still want to marry a man like me." That night, Margaret lay awake, wondering what secret Caleb carried. She thought about the tin cup, about 15 years of isolation, about a man who valued kindness above all else. Whatever he'd done, whatever had driven him to the mountains, she couldn't imagine it changed who he was now. But she also knew that the past had a way of catching up to people on the frontier. Secrets didn't stay buried forever. As she finally drifted toward sleep, she touched the locket at her throat and whispered, "Thomas, I hope I'm making the right choice." The house settled around her, silent and still, offering no answers. The next morning dawned clear and cool, autumn finally asserting itself over the lingering warmth of summer. Caleb arrived at Margaret's boarding house with 2 horses, his roan and a gentle mare he'd borrowed from the livery. "It's about an hour's ride," he said. "Beautiful country up there, and private. We can talk without the whole town listening." Margaret hadn't ridden in years, but she managed to settle into the saddle with only a little awkwardness. They rode out of town in the early morning light, taking the trail that wound up into the foothills. The prairie gradually gave way to scrub pine and rocky outcroppings, the air growing cleaner and cooler as they climbed. Caleb led them to a meadow overlooking the valley, with Timber Creek visible as a collection of small buildings far below. He helped Margaret dismount, and they sat on a fallen log, looking out at the vast landscape. "It's beautiful," Margaret said. "I can see why you love it up here." Caleb nodded, but his expression was troubled. He was quiet for a long moment, and Margaret waited, knowing he needed to find his own way into whatever he needed to tell her. 15 years ago, when I came through Timber Creek, he finally began, I wasn't just looking for work. I was running from the law. Margaret felt her breath catch, but she kept her face calm. "Tell me." "I worked for a man in Missouri named Thaddeus Crane. He owned a railroad company, had his hands in half the businesses in the county. I was hired as a worker on his construction crews, but I was good with numbers, so I got moved up to clerk work, keeping records." Caleb picked up a piece of bark from the log, turning it over in his hands. "One night I was working late in the office. Crane came in with another man, a rival businessman named Samuel Porter. They were arguing about land rights, railroad routes, money. The argument got heated. I tried to stay quiet, keep working, not draw attention. But then Crane pulled a gun." Margaret's hand went to her mouth. "I watched Thaddeus Crane shoot Samuel Porter dead, right there in that office. Then Crane turned and saw me. I'd witnessed the whole thing. He stood there with the gun in his hand and told me very calmly that I had two choices. I could swear that Porter pulled a gun first, that it was self-defense, and Crane would make sure I was well taken care of. Or I could tell the truth and hang for the murder myself." "But you were innocent," Margaret said. "Didn't matter. Crane had money, influence, half the law in his pocket. He could make it look like I did it, plant evidence, buy witnesses. And who would believe a poor clerk over a wealthy railroad baron? He gave me until morning to decide." Caleb threw the piece of bark away, watching it tumble down the hillside. "I ran. I took what little I had and fled. Figured I'd rather take my chances as a fugitive than trust Crane's version of justice. I made it as far as Timber Creek before I ran out of money and strength. That's when you found me by the well. Not just a drifter looking for work, but a man running from a murder charge." Margaret tried to process this. "So you've been hiding all these years?" "I've been surviving. I figured in the mountains, no law could find me. And I've been watching, through traders and newspapers they'd bring up, waiting to hear what happened with Crane. For years, nothing. Then about 5 years ago, I heard Crane had died of a heart attack. But by then, I'd built a life. I didn't know if the warrant was still active, didn't know if coming back to civilization would mean arrest. But you came to town anyway. Because I heard about the brides, and I thought about you, about that kindness you showed me when I had nothing. I realized I'd spent 15 years hiding, and I was tired of it. I wanted to see if there was still something worth living for, beyond just surviving." Margaret stood and walked to the edge of the meadow, looking out at the mountains. Her mind was racing. This changed everything. Or did it? She thought about the man she'd come to know over these weeks of courtship. Patient, kind, thoughtful. A man who'd kept a tin cup for 15 years out of gratitude. Could that man be a murderer? "Did you kill Samuel Porter?" she asked, without turning around. "No." Crane pulled the trigger. "I swear it on everything I hold sacred." "Then why didn't you go to the authorities later, after Crane died?" "By then, I'd been a fugitive for 10 years. How would it look? A wanted man suddenly claiming innocence after the only person who could contradict his story was dead? I had no proof, no witnesses except myself, and I'd run instead of facing trial. That makes a man look guilty." Margaret turned to face him. "Are you still wanted?" "I don't know. I've been in town for weeks now, and no one's come for me. But Pierce has been digging, asking questions. If he finds out about Missouri, about the warrant—" Before he could finish, they heard horses approaching. Margaret and Caleb turned to see Sheriff Brennan riding up the trail, and behind him, a man Margaret didn't recognize, dressed in a dark suit with a federal marshal's badge gleaming on his chest. Caleb's face went pale. "Margaret, I'm sorry. I should have told you sooner." Sheriff Brennan dismounted, his expression grim. "Caleb Stone, I need you to come with me." The marshal stepped forward, pulling a folded paper from his coat. "Caleb Stone, I have a warrant for your arrest issued by the state of Missouri for the murder of Samuel Porter in 1867. You need to come peacefully." Margaret felt the world tilt. "Wait, there must be some mistake." "No mistake, ma'am," the marshal said. "We received a telegram 3 days ago from someone in town saying Stone was here. I came as quickly as I could." "Pierce," Caleb said quietly. "He must have found out somehow." Sheriff Brennan looked genuinely regretful. "I'm sorry, Caleb. I have to follow the law, but I promise you'll get a fair hearing." "In Missouri?" Caleb laughed bitterly. "Where Crane owned half the judges." "Crane's dead," the marshal said. "Things might be different now." Margaret found her voice. "He's innocent. He witnessed the murder but didn't commit it." "That's for a court to decide, ma'am," the marshal said, not unkindly. "But right now, I need him to come with me." Caleb looked at Margaret, his eyes full of regret and resignation. "I'm sorry. I wanted to tell you away from town, give you time to decide what to do. But I ran out of time." "You're not guilty," Margaret said firmly, walking to stand beside him. "And I'm not letting you face this alone." The marshal moved to put Caleb in irons, but Sheriff Brennan stopped him. "That's not necessary. He's not dangerous, and he's given us no trouble." The ride back to town was silent and terrible. Margaret's mind raced. This couldn't be happening. Not now. Not when she'd finally opened her heart again. Not when she'd found someone who valued kindness and remembered grace. By the time they reached Timber Creek, word had spread. The main street was lined with people. Some curious, some sympathetic, some satisfied. Margaret saw Donald Pierce standing outside the general store, his arms crossed, and a slight smile on his face. She rode straight up to him, fury blazing in her eyes. "You did this." "I protected this town," Pierce said smoothly. "Found out through my contacts that your mountain man was wanted for murder. Civic duty to report it." "He's innocent." "That's what they all say, Mrs. Hayes. Maybe you should be more careful who you associate with." Sheriff Brennan led Caleb to the jail, and Margaret followed. Inside the small building, Brennan unlocked the cell with obvious reluctance. "I'll make sure you're treated fairly," Brennan said, "and I'll send a telegrams, see what I can find out about the case." Caleb stepped into the cell, then turned back to Margaret. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the tin cup. He'd carried it with him up to the meadow. "Take this," he said, holding it through the bars. "You gave it to me once. I want you to have it back. You don't owe me anything, Margaret. Walk away if you need to. I'd understand." Margaret took the cup, then closed his hands around hers. "I'm not walking away. You've spent 15 years remembering kindness. Let me show you what it means to have someone remember you." Tears ran down Caleb's weathered face. "I don't deserve you. You deserve justice," Margaret said. "And you're going to get it. I promise you that." She left the jail with the tin cup clutched in her hands, her mind already working. There had to be a way to prove Caleb's innocence. 15 years was a long time, but truth had a way of surviving even when buried. She walked to her boarding house past the staring townspeople, past Sarah's worried face, past the satisfied smirk on Donald Pierce's face. She went inside, set the tin cup on her kitchen table, and began to plan. Caleb Stone had remembered her kindness for 15 years. Now it was time for her to return that gift in the only way that mattered. She was going to save him. Margaret didn't sleep that night. She sat at her kitchen's table with paper and pen, making notes, trying to think through every angle. What did she know? What could she prove? Who might help? Sarah arrived at dawn, letting herself in through the back door as she often did. She found Margaret still sitting at the table, surrounded by papers, the tin cup placed in the center like a talisman. "Tell me what you need," Sarah said simply. Margaret looked up at her friend with exhausted, determined eyes. "I need to prove he's innocent, but I don't know how. Then let's figure it out together." They started with what they knew. Caleb had witnessed Thaddeus Crane murder Samuel Porter in Missouri in 1867. Crane had threatened Caleb into running rather than testifying. Crane was now dead. But somewhere there had to be evidence, something that could corroborate Caleb's story. Pastor Williams arrived mid-morning, having heard about the arrest. Margaret expected judgment, but instead he offered help. "I have connections to churches across the territories," he said, "including some in Missouri. Let me see what I can find out about this case, about Crane, about what really happened." By afternoon, half the town knew Margaret was investigating. Some people offered support. Mrs. Chen brought food and information about a cousin in St. Louis who might help. Even Emma, the young bride from Boston, stopped by to say she believed in Caleb's innocence. But there was also opposition. Donald Pierce made his views known loudly at the saloon. "That mountain man fooled her. She's making herself look ridiculous defending a murderer." Margaret ignored the talk and focused on gathering information. Sheriff Brennan, though bound by duty to hold Caleb, shared what he knew about the original case. The warrant was old, the details sparse. Samuel Porter had been shot in Crane's office. Caleb Stone had been identified as the killer by Crane himself and had fled, which was taken as evidence of guilt. But there was no trial, Brennan pointed out, just a warrant issued based on Crane's testimony. In 15 years, no one followed up. No one pushed for extradition. It's like everyone forgot about it. Or Crane made sure everyone forgot, Margaret said. If he had that much influence, he could have kept it quiet. Maybe. But proving that now, 15 years later, with Crane dead, that's going to be near impossible. Margaret refused to accept that. There had to be someone who knew the truth, someone who'd witnessed something, some piece of evidence that had survived. The breakthrough came 3 days later from an unexpected source. Mrs. Chen's brother in St. Louis had asked around about the old case, and he'd found something. He sent a telegram. "Railroad worker remembers. Says he knows truth. Will write testimony. Dying. Acts of conscience." Margaret's hands shook as she read the telegram. "We need to get to him. We need that testimony." "St. Louis is 5 days by train," Sarah said. "Can you afford to leave the boarding house that long?" "I'll manage the house," Sarah said immediately. "You go. Get that testimony." But there was a problem. The U.S. Marshal who'd arrested Caleb was planning to transport him back to Missouri within the week. If Margaret didn't get the testimony before then, it might be too late. Margaret visited Caleb in the jail that evening. He looked thinner, the confinement clearly weighing on him. But his eyes lit up when he saw her. "You shouldn't be here," he said. "People are talking. Let them talk. I have news." She told him about the witness in St. Louis, about the telegram, about her plan to travel there and get written testimony. Caleb listened, then shook his head. "Margaret, no. It's too dangerous for you to travel alone. And what if this witness doesn't have anything useful? You'd be risking everything for maybe nothing." "It's not nothing if it saves you," Margaret said firmly. "Caleb, You kept a tin cup for 15 years because I gave you water. You think I'm going to do less when your life is at stake? I don't want you to sacrifice yourself for me. I'm not sacrificing anything. I'm fighting for what's right, for truth, for—" She paused, realizing what she was about to say. "For the man I love." The words hung in the air between them. It was the first time either of them had spoken of love directly, and the moment was both terrible and perfect. Caleb reached through the bars and took her hand. "Margaret Hayes, you are the bravest, most stubborn, most wonderful woman I've ever known. Then let me do this. Let me fight for you." Caleb's eyes were wet with tears. "You already have. Just by believing me, you've given me more than I deserve. But please, be careful. Don't let Pierce or anyone else stop you." Margaret left the jail and went straight to the train station. The next eastbound train departed in 2 days. She bought a ticket with money she'd saved for boarding house repairs, knowing this was more important. But Donald Pierce wasn't finished interfering. Word reached Margaret the next morning that Pierce had visited the marshal, suggesting that Margaret herself might be helping a fugitive, that she should be watched carefully, that perhaps her travel should be restricted. Sheriff Brennan came to warn her. "Pierce is trying to make trouble for you. The marshal is a decent man, but he's also careful about procedure. If Pierce pushes hard enough, he might try to stop you from leaving town." "On what grounds?" "Doesn't need grounds, just suspicion. Federal marshal has broad authority when it comes to fugitives and anyone connected to them." Margaret felt panic rising but pushed it down. She had 1 day before the train. She needed to leave before Pierce could interfere further. That night, she packed quickly and quietly. She left detailed instructions with Sarah for managing the boarding house. She wrote a letter to Caleb in case something went wrong, telling him everything she felt, but had been too cautious to say. At 3 in the morning, she slipped out of her house and made her way to the train station. The eastbound train wasn't due until noon, but she wanted to be there early, before Pierce could know she'd gone. She sat in the empty station waiting room as dawn broke over the prairie, clutching her travel bag and thinking about what lay ahead. She'd never traveled alone before, never gone so far from home without a husband or companion. But she thought about Caleb's face when she'd said she loved him, about 15 years of keeping a tin cup out of gratitude, about a man who valued kindness above all else. By mid-morning, word must have spread that she was leaving. Sarah arrived with food for the journey, and Pastor Williams came to pray for her safe travel. Even Mrs. Chen stopped by with a small package. "Special tea," Mrs. Chen said, "for when you're tired and need strength. And this," she pressed a small amount of money into Margaret's hand, "for emergencies. Don't argue." Margaret hugged her, overwhelmed by the support. When the train finally arrived, belching steam and cinders, Margaret climbed aboard with her heart pounding. She found a seat by the window and watched as Timber Creek began to shrink in the distance. She was leaving everything familiar, traveling hundreds of miles alone, chasing the testimony of a dying man she'd never met, trying to save a man who'd been accused of murder 15 years ago. It was reckless, impractical, and possibly foolish. But as the train carried her eastward across the prairie, Margaret felt something she hadn't felt in years. Purpose. She was fighting for something that mattered, for someone who mattered. She was choosing action over resignation, courage over comfort. 5 days later, Margaret arrived in St. Louis, exhausted and overwhelmed by the city's noise and crowds. Armed with Mrs. Chen's brother's directions, she found her way to a modest neighborhood where James McCarthy lived, the railroad worker who claimed to know the truth about Samuel Porter's death. The house was small and worn, and the woman who answered the door looked at Margaret with suspicion until she explained who she was and why she'd come. "My husband is very sick," Mrs. McCarthy said. "The doctors say it won't be long now, but he's been troubled in his mind about something from years ago. Maybe talking to you will bring him peace." James McCarthy lay in a bed by the window, thin and pale, breathing with difficulty, but his eyes were clear when Margaret sat beside him. "You came all this way," he said, his voice weak. "I did. For Caleb Stone. They say he killed Samuel Porter, but he says he's innocent." McCarthy nodded slowly. "He is innocent. I know because I was there." Margaret's heart leapt. "Tell me everything." McCarthy closed his eyes, gathering strength. "I worked for Crane's Railroad, maintenance crew. That night, I was doing repairs in the building, in a back room, near Crane's office. I heard voices, then shouting. I looked through a crack in the door and saw Crane arguing with Porter. Then I saw Crane pull a gun and shoot Porter dead. I saw the clerk, Stone, sitting at his desk, saw his face when it happened. That boy was terrified, in shock. He didn't do anything." "Why didn't you come forward?" Margaret asked gently. "Because Crane saw me. After Stone ran out, Crane found me hiding. He told me if I ever spoke about what I saw, he'd kill my family, my wife, my children. I believed him. Crane was a powerful, ruthless man. So I stayed quiet, and I've lived with that guilt every day since." Tears ran down his weathered face. "But Crane's dead now. My children are grown, and I'm dying. I want to make this right before I go." Margaret pulled out paper and pen. "Will you write it down? Everything you saw? I'll do better than that. I'll dictate it to you, and I'll sign it in front of witnesses." Over the next hour, with Mrs. McCarthy and a neighbor serving as witnesses, James McCarthy gave his full testimony. He described the night, what he saw, Crane's threats, everything. He signed the document with a shaking hand, and the witnesses signed below. Margaret carefully folded the papers and tucked them into her bag. "Thank you, Mr. McCarthy. You're giving an innocent man his life back." "I should have done it years ago," McCarthy said. "Don't wait as long as I did to do what's right, Mrs. Hayes. Life's too short for that kind of regret." Margaret took the first train back to Timber Creek, the testimony papers never leaving her possession. She'd been gone 8 days, and every mile felt like an eternity. She had what she needed. But would it be enough? Would the marshal and the Missouri authorities accept testimony from a dying man who'd waited 15 years to come forward? As the train carried her back across the prairie, Margaret prayed for the first time in years. Not formal prayers, but honest pleas from her heart. Let this work. Let justice be done. Let Caleb be free. The train pulled into Timber Creek Station in the late afternoon of the 9th day. Margaret climbed down with her bag, exhausted but triumphant, clutching the papers that could save the man she loved. She walked straight to the sheriff's office, ready to present her evidence, ready to fight for Caleb's freedom. But when she opened the door, she found the office in chaos. The marshal was there, along with Sheriff Brennan and several townspeople, all talking at once. "What's happened?" Margaret demanded. Sheriff Brennan turned to her, relief flooding his face. "Margaret, thank God. The marshal is taking Stone tomorrow morning. We've run out of time." 3 days felt like 3 years. Margaret spent every waking hour at the sheriff's office or nearby, waiting for telegrams, praying for verification. The whole town seemed to hold its breath. On the first day, a telegram came from Pastor Williams's contact in St. Louis, confirming that James McCarthy existed, was indeed dying, and was known as an honest man. But Marshal Howard said that wasn't enough. He needed official verification from Missouri authorities. On the second day, nothing came. Margaret sat outside the jail, teaching Caleb to play cards through the bars, both of them pretending they weren't counting every hour. Sarah brought food that neither of them ate. The sun set on the second day, with no news, and Margaret felt hope slipping away. The morning of the third day dawned grey and cold. Autumn had fully arrived, bringing the first real chill of the season. Margaret arrived at the sheriff's office to find Marshal Howard preparing papers for transport. "No verification came," he said, not unkindly. "I have to proceed." "It's only been 2 days," Margaret protested. "Telegrams can be delayed, responses can take time." "I gave 3 days. Time's up." The telegraph machine suddenly clattered to life. Everyone in the office froze. The operator, old Mr. Henderson, began transcribing the message, his hand moving quickly across the paper. When he finished, he looked up at Marshal Howard. "It's from the Missouri Attorney General's office." Howard took the telegram, his face unreadable as he scanned it. Margaret felt her heart hammering so hard she thought it might break through her chest. "Well?" Sheriff Brennan demanded. Howard read aloud. "James McCarthy testimony reviewed, cross-referenced with railroad company records from 1867. Records show McCarthy employed at location on date in question. Additional investigation reveals Thaddeus Crane, history of intimidation and violence toward employees, multiple complaints filed but never prosecuted due to Crane's influence. McCarthy testimony deemed credible. Warrant for Caleb Stone nullified. All charges dropped. Stone free to go." The office erupted. Margaret felt her knees buckle, and Sarah caught her arm. Through the bars, Caleb stood motionless, as if he didn't dare believe what he'd heard. "Say it again," Caleb said hoarsely. Howard walked to the cell, pulling out his keys. "You're free, Mr. Stone. The warrant has been nullified. The state of Missouri apologizes for the error." The cell door swung open. Caleb stepped out slowly, like a man learning to walk again. Margaret ran to him, and he caught her in his arms, both of them shaking with relief and joy. "You saved me," he whispered into her hair. "You actually saved me." "We saved each other," Margaret said. The news spread through Timber Creek like wildfire. By noon, the town square was filled with people wanting to congratulate Caleb and Margaret. Even some who'd been skeptical came forward to apologize. Emma, the young bride, brought flowers. Mrs. Chen brought a bottle of good whiskey she'd been saving for a special occasion. Not everyone was pleased. Donald Pierce stood at the edge of the crowd, his face dark with fury. He'd bet on Caleb's guilt and lost. More than that, he'd revealed his own vindictiveness to the entire town. His reputation had taken a hit, and everyone knew it. Sarah pulled Margaret aside. "Pierce is going to be trouble. Men like that don't forgive being made to look foolish." "Let him try," Margaret said, with a confidence she'd never felt before. "I'm done being intimidated." That evening, as the celebration died down, Pastor Williams approached Caleb and Margaret with a gentle smile. "I don't suppose you two would like to get married?" he asked. "Since you've been through just about everything else a couple can face, might as well make it official." Margaret and Caleb looked at each other. They'd planned an October wedding, had wanted time for a proper courtship. But standing there in the fading light, having just walked through fire together, waiting seemed unnecessary. "Yes," Margaret said. "Right now?" Caleb asked, wonder in his voice. "Why not? We've waited long enough. We've earned this." Pastor Williams laughed. "Well, I've never done a wedding quite this spontaneous, but I don't see why not. Let me gather some witnesses." Within an hour, the town square was filled again, this time for a wedding. Someone brought lanterns and torches. Sarah stood as Margaret's witness. Sheriff Brennan stood for Caleb. The young brides came with their new husbands. Mrs. Chen closed her store to attend. Even Mr. Patterson, Margaret's elderly boarder, made his way down to watch. The ceremony was simple. Pastor Williams spoke about love and faith, about perseverance and grace. When it came time for vows, Caleb took Margaret's hands and spoke from his heart. "Margaret Hayes, you saved my life twice. Once with water and kindness when I was lost. Again with courage and faith when I was condemned. You taught me that one small act of grace can echo through years, changing everything. I promise to honor that lesson every day of our life together. I promise to be worthy of your love, your strength, and your stubbornness." The crowd laughed through their tears. Margaret looked into Caleb's weathered face and spoke her own vows. "Caleb Stone, you taught me that kindness matters more than anything else in this world. You remembered grace when everyone else had forgotten. You valued my heart over my appearance, my character over my age. You made me believe in second chances and new beginnings. I promise to walk beside you, wherever that path leads, for all the days we're given." Pastor Williams pronounced them husband and wife as the sun set over the prairie, painting the sky in shades of gold and crimson. When Caleb and Margaret kissed, the crowd erupted in cheers. Donald Pierce watched from the shadows at the edge of the square, then turned and walked away into the darkness. His plans had failed, but men like Pierce always had more plans. For now, though, that didn't matter. What mattered was Margaret and Caleb, standing together in the lamplight, finally free to begin the life they'd both chosen. 1 month after the wedding. Margaret and Caleb stood on the porch of her boarding house, now their boarding house, loading a wagon for their journey to the mountains. Winter was coming, but they'd decided to make one trip up to Caleb's cabin before the heavy snows arrived. Margaret wanted to see the place that had been his home for 15 years, to understand that part of his life. Sarah had agreed to manage the boarding house during their absence, with Margaret planning to return in the spring. They'd worked out an arrangement that felt right to both of them. Summers in the mountains where Caleb's spirit was most at peace, other seasons in town where Margaret could maintain her independence and her business. "You're sure about this?" Caleb asked as he secured the last bundle. "It's rough country, and the cabin isn't fancy. I've lived through a murder accusation, a desperate journey to St. Louis, and gossip that would have broken a weaker woman," Margaret said with a smile. "I think I can handle your cabin." The townspeople gathered to see them off, a much friendlier crowd than the one that had watched Caleb's arrest. Mrs. Chen pressed packages of tea and preserved goods into Margaret's hands. Pastor Williams offered a blessing for their journey. Even Emma and several of the other young brides came to wish them well. "You gave us all courage," Emma said shyly. "Watching you fight for what you believed in, for who you love. It made us braver in our own lives." Margaret hugged her, surprised by how much the young woman's words meant. She'd never thought of herself as courageous, just determined. But maybe they were the same thing. As they prepared to leave, Sheriff Brennan rode up with news. "Thought you'd want to know. Pierce sold his ranch. He's leaving Timber Creek." "Running away?" Caleb asked. More like his reputation caught up with him. Turns out a lot of people were tired of his bullying, and after that business with you two, folks started speaking up about other things he'd done. Town council asked him to step down. He decided to sell out and move on. Margaret felt no satisfaction in Pierce's departure, only relief. Some battles weren't worth continuing. "One more thing," Brennan said, pulling an envelope from his coat. "This came for you. From Missouri." Margaret opened it to find a formal letter of apology from the state of Missouri, along with a modest monetary compensation for the 15 years Caleb had lived as a fugitive due to their failure to investigate properly. It wasn't much, couldn't possibly make up for lost time, but it was acknowledgement that justice had finally been served. "We could use this to expand the boarding house," Margaret said, showing Caleb the amount. "Or save it for whatever comes." "Whatever comes," Caleb echoed, his hand covering hers. They climbed onto the wagon, and Caleb took the reins. As they rolled out of Timber Creek, Margaret looked back at the town that had been her home for 20 years. So much had changed in just a few months. She'd gone from resigned widow to determined investigator to newlywed, heading toward an adventure she'd never imagined. The journey to the mountains took 3 days. They camped under the stars, and Caleb taught Margaret to read the night sky, pointing out constellations and explaining how he'd navigated by them. Margaret told him stories about Thomas, about their early years together, and she was grateful that Caleb listened without jealousy, understanding that honoring the past didn't diminish the present. When they finally reached Caleb's cabin, Margaret understood why he'd loved it. The small structure sat in a high meadow, surrounded by pine forest, with a clear stream running nearby and a view of distant peaks that took her breath away. The silence was profound, not empty, but full of wind and bird song and the rustle of trees. "It's beautiful," Margaret whispered, afraid to disturb the peace. Inside, the cabin was simple but well made. One room with a fireplace, a bed Caleb had built himself, shelves lined with books, and tools hanging neatly on the walls. Everything spoke of care and craftsmanship, of a man who'd made a life alone but hadn't let that solitude make him careless or crude. On the mantel above the fireplace, Margaret saw a space that had clearly held something important. There was less dust there, a small empty spot. "The tin cup," she said, understanding. "You kept it there." "Every day," Caleb confirmed, "reminded me why I was surviving, not just existing." Margaret pulled out the tin cup, which she'd brought with her, and placed it back in its spot on the mantel. Beside it, she set her silver locket with Thomas's ring inside. "Past and present," she said. "Both honored, both part of who we are." That evening, they sat by the fire as snow began to fall outside, the first real storm of winter. Caleb had pulled out a new journal, a wedding gift from Pastor Williams, and Margaret watched as he opened it to the first blank page. "What will you write?" she asked. "Our story," Caleb said. "Everything that happened. Maybe someday someone will read it and understand that kindness matters, that grace has power, that it's never too late for second chances." Margaret moved closer, resting her head on his shoulder. "Start with the truth. Sometimes the kindest gesture in our darkest hour stays with us forever." Caleb began to write, his hand moving slowly across the page. Margaret closed her eyes, listening to the scratch of pen on paper, the crackle of fire, the wind outside. She thought about the tin cup on the mantel, about a blue ribbon she'd once worn in her hair, about how a single act of kindness had rippled through 15 years to bring her to this moment. She'd been the oldest bride, the one no one expected to be chosen. But Caleb had seen past youth and beauty to something deeper, to character, to kindness, to the things that truly mattered. And in choosing her, he'd given her something she'd thought was lost forever, the chance to love and be loved, to adventure and grow, to be more than just a woman surviving, but a woman truly living. Outside, snow continued to fall, blanketing the mountains in white. Inside the cabin, two people who'd found each other against all odds sat together in the firelight, writing the first page of their future. Margaret looked at the tin cup gleaming on the mantel, that simple, ordinary object that had become extraordinary through memory and meaning. 15 years ago, she'd given water to a stranger without thinking twice. Now that stranger was her husband, and that small kindness had transformed both their lives. She understood now what Caleb had tried to tell her from the beginning. It wasn't about the water or the cup or even the memory itself. It was about what that moment represented, that in a harsh world, in difficult times, choosing kindness could change everything, that seeing another person's humanity, treating them with dignity when no one else would, was an act of grace that echoed far beyond the moment itself. "What are you thinking?" Caleb asked, looking up from his writing. "That I'm glad I filled that cup," Margaret said simply. "That I'm glad you remembered. That I'm glad we found our way back to each other." Caleb set down his pen and took her hand. "Every day for the rest of my life, I'll be grateful you saw me that day, that you chose kindness, that you gave me a reason to keep going. And every day for the rest of mine, I'll be grateful you came back, that you valued kindness above everything else, that you chose the oldest bride." They sat together as night deepened and snow fell, two souls who'd found their way through darkness to light, through isolation to companionship, through fear to love. The tin cup and the locket sat side by side on the mantel, artifacts of different loves, different lives, both honored and both part of the story still being written. Tomorrow they would explore the mountains together. In spring, they would return to Timber Creek and the boarding house. Life would continue with its mixture of joy and hardship, triumphs and struggles. But they would face it together, two people who understood that the greatest treasures in life weren't gold or youth or beauty. They were kindness remembered, grace extended, and love freely given. The fire burned low, and Margaret finally stood to add more wood. As she did, she caught sight of her reflection in the dark window. A woman of 48 with silver in her hair and lines on her face. No longer young, but somehow more beautiful than she'd ever been. She saw strength there, and courage, and a joy that had been missing for years. She thought about all the young brides lined up that day in the town square, about how everyone had expected Caleb to choose youth and beauty. And she smiled, understanding finally what he'd seen when he looked at her. He'd seen someone who'd survived loss and hardship without becoming bitter, someone who'd built a life alone without losing her capacity for kindness, someone who'd fought for justice and truth even when it was hard and frightening, someone whose age represented not decline, but wisdom, experience, and strength tempered by fire. He'd chosen well, and so had she. Margaret returned to Caleb's side, and they sat together in comfortable silence, watching the fire and listening to the wind. Outside, the mountain night was cold and vast. Inside, wrapped in warmth and love, they were home, and somewhere in a town hundreds of miles away, in a quiet cemetery on a hill, a simple wooden cross marked a grave where wild roses grew. If Thomas Hayes could have known the story that unfolded after his death, he would have smiled. His Margaret had found her way through grief to joy, through loneliness to love. She'd kept her promise to stay open to life, and it had brought her, finally, to exactly where she needed to be.